The video opens with a chilling scene on a fog-laden Venetian canal at dawn. A child's voice echoes through the water, claiming memories of sunken streets and drowned faces. Fishermen whisper of a boy who speaks of the city beneath the waves. The introduction sets an immediate, eerie tension, contrasting the innocence of a child with the horror of a city remembered in death. The audience is drawn into both mystery and historical setting without explanation, feeling unsettled and compelled to follow the story. The mist hung thick over the Grand Canal that morning, curling around the wooden poles that lined the docks, softening the edges of Venice into something otherworldly. Gas lamps flickered with the stubbornness of spirits refusing to die, and the water beneath the gondolas was an endless mirror of shadow and fog. It was the sort of dawn where the living city seemed to hold its breath, and the dead whispered just beneath the surface. Pietro, a boy of 7, wandered alone along the narrow alleys that spilled toward the water, his small bare feet splashing in the shallow puddles left by the tide. He seemed ordinary, dressed in a worn tunic patched in several places, but there was a look in his eyes that unsettled those who glimpsed him, a certainty, a knowing that did not belong to a child. The first whispers began on the edges of the fishermen's conversations, carried by the wind across the rippling water. "He speaks of streets that do not exist," one said, watching Pietro from the prow of his gondola. "And of faces, drowned faces that smile from beneath the canals." Others laughed nervously, attributing the boy's words to imagination or playful exaggeration, but a few could not shake the shiver that ran down their spines. When Pietro spoke, his voice carried across the still water with a strange, unearthly clarity, as if the canals themselves had lent him their breath. He recounted alleys and bridges that had been lost to storms and centuries, naming them with an authority no child should possess. Inside the modest home where he lived with his mother and elderly grandmother, Pietro's family first dismissed his stories as childish fantasy. Yet his recollections grew more precise, more vivid, until it was impossible to ignore the details. He spoke of houses that had crumbled into the lagoon, of markets swallowed by floodwaters, of bells that had rung centuries before his birth. At night, he would wake screaming, whispering names of people he insisted he had known in lives long past, their eyes full of sorrow beneath the waves. The candlelight flickered across his pale face, accentuating the intensity of his gaze and the depth of fear and wonder it evoked. His mother would clutch him tightly, unsure whether to comfort him or fear what he seemed to carry inside. Word of the boy spread slowly, first through the alleys and canals of Venice, then beyond to the markets where merchants paused mid-sail to listen. People began to speak of him with a mixture of awe and dread, calling him, the child who remembers the drowned. There were those who claimed he could recount tragedies unrecorded in history, that he could navigate the city beneath the city, as though the very waters had imprinted their memory upon his soul. Fishermen who had spent lifetimes on the canal swore they had seen him standing silently on the banks, eyes closed, lips moving, as though he were conversing with voices no one else could hear. Yet for all the fear and fascination, Pietro remained a child. He laughed with neighbors, played with scraps of rope and driftwood, and chased stray cats across the bridges. There was a terrifying juxtaposition in his existence, moments of pure innocence and wonder set against a backdrop of knowledge that was impossible, dark, and incomprehensible. Every description he offered of submerged streets or forgotten tragedies was accompanied by a childlike curiosity, as if he were simply exploring a new game rather than recounting a past life steeped in death and sorrow. That morning, as the sun began to lift the fog just enough to catch the green of the moss-covered stones, Pietro approached a gondolier repairing his boat. He leaned over the edge of the dock and pointed to a cluster of waterlogged buildings no longer standing above the surface. "There," he said softly. "There was a bakery. And the family, they did not leave. They waited beneath the water." The gondolier froze, heart hammering in his chest. There was no bakery, no trace of a family, yet the boy described the layout of the building, the placement of the hearth, even the smells he claimed lingered still in the stone. As the city slowly awoke, Pietro's voice carried across the canals, drawing more eyes and ears. Some followed him silently, not daring to speak, haunted by the certainty in his tone. Others recoiled, afraid of the uncanny knowledge a child could possess. Shadows of disbelief and awe intertwined in the morning light, setting the stage for a tale that would grow darker and more intricate with every passing day. Pietro walked the labyrinth of Venice with the weight of memory pressing on him, a burden far beyond his years, as if he alone could bridge the living city with the drowned world lying beneath its waters. By the time the fog began to lift completely, the whispers had grown into a quiet chorus across the canals. People spoke of the child with reverence, with dread, and sometimes with disbelief so sharp it cut through reason. Yet the boy remained, small and fragile, but radiant with a strange, unbearable certainty. The city, in its eternal mist, seemed to pause and listen, as if Venice itself recognized that one of its children had glimpsed secrets that were not meant for the living. The stage was set, the tension palpable, and the story of Pietro, the boy who remembered lifetimes beneath the sea, had begun. Venice in 1891 was a city suspended between glory and decay, a place where beauty and ruin existed side by side with a quiet inevitability. Its canals, narrow and winding, carried not just gondolas but centuries of stories, whispers of forgotten lives, and the echoes of history that clung stubbornly to stone and water. The city's architecture spoke of opulence long past, with marble palaces leaning precariously over green, algae-stained waters, while less fortunate buildings sagged under the weight of neglect and time. Gas lamps flickered along the quays, struggling to illuminate alleyways that twisted like veins through the labyrinth of Venice, casting shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of brine, wood smoke, and the faint decay of the city's foundations, a smell that made every passerby acutely aware that Venice was alive but fragile, clinging desperately to its past. In this city of contrasts, Pietro's family lived a modest life, wedged between the grandeur of forgotten nobility and the grime of working canals. His father had passed away years before, leaving his mother to care for Pietro and his aging grandmother. Their home, small and weathered, perched on a quiet canal, its foundations sinking slowly into the water beneath. The interior smelled of damp wood and lavender, an attempt at domestic comfort in a city that had learned to survive on resilience rather than luxury. Everyday life was a rhythm of chores, errands through bustling markets, and trips to the docks, where the family relied on fishing and small trade for survival. Yet even within this ordinary existence, the city's magic and menace seeped in through the walls and streets, shaping the way its inhabitants moved and thought. The canals themselves were characters in the city's story, twisting and turning with secrets that only Venice could know. Gondoliers spoke of currents that had swallowed men and goods alike, of waters that shifted like a living creature, hiding and revealing ruins with equal indifference. Children ran along the edges, their laughter mingling with the creaking of boats and the occasional cry of gulls overhead. But Pietro saw more than they did. He noticed patterns in the ripples, echoes of events long past. He would pause, staring intently at certain patches of water, murmuring names and dates that were invisible to everyone else. This awareness set him apart, making him both extraordinary and dangerously enigmatic in a city that already seemed haunted by its own history. Life in Venice was a delicate balance between survival and spectacle. Markets were crowded with merchants selling fruits, spices, and fabrics, their cries competing with the bells of churches and the splash of oars. Festivals brought music and laughter to the squares, yet these moments of joy were always tempered by an awareness of decay and mortality. Disease lurked in quiet corners, water seeped through foundations, and the very ground upon which the city stood was slowly sinking, a reminder that Venice had survived for centuries not through dominance but through adaptation and persistence. For Pietro, these contradictions were mirrored in the strange knowledge he carried, knowledge of lives submerged and forgotten, a secret Venice beneath the Venice that everyone else knew. His mother, Lucia, often worried for him, watching the intensity in his eyes as he wandered the streets. She had grown up hearing stories of the city's past, tales of plague, floods, and betrayals, but nothing could prepare her for the certainty with which her son spoke. His grandmother, a woman hardened by years of hardship, tried to dismiss it as childish fancy, yet she too found herself pausing when Pietro named structures that had long since crumbled, recounting tragedies that predated their family. Within the household, these stories began to shift the ordinary rhythms of life into something charged with tension, a mixture of fear, awe, and reverence. Beyond the family home, the city itself seemed to respond to Pietro's presence. Gondoliers paused mid-oar when he passed, merchants lowered their voices, and the elderly leaned from balconies, eyes narrowing with curiosity or suspicion. Even the animals seemed sensitive to him. Stray cats would follow him for hours, and the waterfowl scattered nervously when he approached certain canals. Venice, steeped in memory and legend, appeared to recognize in him a bridge to its forgotten, drowned history. The line between reality and imagination blurred as Pietro navigated streets that had existed in lives before, the child carrying a weight of history no one else could touch. As days passed, the interplay of light and shadow in the city emphasized Venice's eerie duality. Sunlight sparkled off the rippling water, illuminating the gilded facades of palaces, yet darker alleys remained shrouded in gloom, as if hiding secrets that only Pietro could perceive. Markets and taverns buzzed with mundane chatter, but behind closed doors, whispers of the child's strange insights circulated. Some dismissed it as coincidence, while others began to suspect that Venice had never fully surrendered its past, that some truths lingered beneath the surface, waiting for a messenger to reveal them. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the canals in molten gold, Pietro often found himself alone at the edges of the city, tracing the outlines of submerged streets with his small, pointed fingers. He would whisper to the water as if expecting an answer, recounting events no one else could confirm. The city's grandeur and decay mirrored his own contradictions, a child innocent yet burdened, living amidst beauty yet haunted by darkness, standing at the crossroads of history and mystery. Venice in 1891 was not just a setting, it was a living participant in the story, shaping Pietro's experiences and framing every step of a narrative that would grow stranger, darker, and more compelling with each passing day. Pietro's unusual knowledge became impossible to ignore when he began speaking of places he could never have seen, streets that had long since vanished beneath the waters of Venice, and faces of people he insisted he had known in lives before his own. At first, his mother thought it was simply the imagination of a child, a playful attempt to gain attention. She would smile indulgently when he described markets that no longer existed or named residents who had died decades earlier. But as the days passed, it became clear that his recollections were far too precise, far too detailed, to be the product of mere fantasy. He spoke of narrow alleyways filled with the smell of bread, of steps leading to buildings that had crumbled centuries before, and of the laughter of children who had never been alive in his time. In the quiet corners of their small home, Pietro would recount these memories with a voice that was both matter-of-fact and haunting. He described the layout of houses that had been swallowed by floods, the positions of furniture, even the faint traces of paint still clinging to walls beneath the water. His words carried the weight of someone who had walked these spaces, who had lived among the people he described. It was not storytelling, it was testimony. His mother, Lucia, and his grandmother would listen in silence, alternating between awe and fear, struggling to reconcile the innocence of his age with the profundity of what he revealed. One evening, Pietro spoke of a bridge that had collapsed during a violent storm decades earlier, naming the exact date and the families who had perished. The level of detail stunned his mother, who had only heard fragments of local legends. She asked him how he could know such things. Pietro's response was simple and chilling: "I was there. I remember them." He went on to describe the sound of the wood splintering, the cries of those trapped beneath the water, and the way the moonlight had danced on the turbulent waves. Every detail he offered was vivid and specific, painting a picture of tragedy and loss that seemed impossibly accurate for a child who had lived only 7 years. At first, the neighbors dismissed Pietro's accounts as fanciful stories, the sort of thing a precocious child might invent. Yet the whispers began to grow, fueled by uncanny coincidences. Pietro would describe events that, when cross-referenced with historical records or the memories of older Venetians, matched facts previously thought forgotten. He recounted details of buildings and streets that had disappeared without documentation, spoke of minor accidents that no written record preserved, and named residents who had been lost to the floods. His mother began to fear for his safety, knowing that curiosity and suspicion could easily turn dangerous in a city that revered superstition as much as it prized reason. The family struggled with their dual reality. Pietro remained a playful, gentle child in some moments, yet at other times he was a conduit for memories that carried the weight of entire lifetimes. During meals, he would pause mid-bite to describe the merchants who had once sold bread on sunken squares, naming their children and recounting their fates. His laughter and childish mischief existed alongside a profound, unsettling knowledge, creating a tension that grew unbearable. Lucia often felt a cold dread settle over the house when he spoke, as though the air itself had thickened with the presence of the past. Pietro's confessions were not limited to the mundane. He also recounted tragedies, small and large, with startling clarity. He spoke of families who had drowned during floods, of children lost to illness, and of lovers separated by misfortune. He described their clothing, their gestures, the sadness in their eyes, and even the sounds of their voices. The emotional weight of these memories, so vividly rendered, seemed to bypass the innocence of his age. At night, he would lie awake in bed, whispering to the darkness about lives long extinguished, his small hands clutching at sheets as if to hold on to something intangible yet unbearable. The psychological strain on Pietro became evident as the days passed. He began to show signs of exhaustion, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as if burdened by the sheer weight of what he remembered. His mother noticed dark circles beneath his eyes, and his grandmother murmured prayers, fearing the child was somehow caught between the living world and the drowned city he claimed to remember. Pietro himself seemed unaware of the abnormality of his condition. For him, speaking of the past was as natural as breathing, a compulsion that demanded to be voiced regardless of the fear it provoked in those around him. Neighbors who had once laughed at his stories gradually became uneasy observers. Pietro would point out alleyways and structures that no longer existed and describe the lives of those who had perished there. Gondoliers began to pause mid-paddle when he spoke, feeling a chill at the accuracy and vividness of his recollections. Even local priests and scholars, initially skeptical, could not deny the consistency in his descriptions. Questions of morality, faith, and reason began to surface. Was Pietro gifted? Cursed? Or simply a child who carried the echoes of history in a way no one could explain? As Pietro's words reached the streets, whispers of the miraculous and the uncanny began to circulate throughout Venice. People began to see the city differently, half expecting that the waters themselves might answer Pietro's recollections. The line between reality and legend blurred, and Pietro's home became a quiet epicenter of unease, curiosity, and reverence. What had begun as the ramblings of a child had grown into a phenomenon that tugged at the very fabric of Venice, revealing a city layered with memory, tragedy, and the inexplicable persistence of the past. By the end of this period, Pietro's confessions had become daily events, each one adding a layer of suspense, dread, and fascination. His small figure wandering the alleys, murmuring names and describing streets lost to time, was a living bridge between the Venice of 1891 and the submerged histories that no longer had witnesses. Families, neighbors, and visitors found themselves caught in the tension between disbelief and the undeniable reality of his words. Pietro, the child who remembered lifetimes beneath the sea, was no longer merely a boy. He had become a vessel of the past, carrying in his voice the echoes of lives that would not rest quietly beneath the waters of Venice. Word of Pietro's strange knowledge did not remain confined to his home for long. By mid-morning, whispers traveled along the canals, carried on the oars of gondoliers and the chatter of merchants in the markets. The city, already layered with history and superstition, seemed to lean closer to listen. Gondoliers, who had spent decades navigating the twisting waterways and knew the city's every curve and secret passage, began to notice something remarkable. Pietro could name canals that had been filled in decades before, point out submerged buildings with precision, and describe scenes of life that had existed long before the oldest residents were born. Some dismissed it at first as coincidence or youthful imagination, yet the consistency of his accounts made even the most skeptical pause. Fishermen were the first to speak openly of him. They would glide silently along the canals, oars dipping with careful rhythm, then pause as they overheard Pietro speaking to himself, recounting streets lost to floods, families drowned in storm-swollen waters, and merchants who had vanished without record. "He knows the city that no longer exists," murmured one old man, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. Others laughed nervously, wary of being drawn into what they felt might be madness. But those who listened closely could not deny the eerie accuracy of his descriptions. He named buildings, the layout of streets, and even the patterns of light at different times of day in places long submerged. Pietro's presence on the canals began to draw attention beyond the small community of his family. Children would trail after him, wide-eyed, as he described events they could not comprehend. Adults would avert their eyes, unnerved by the certainty in his voice. Sometimes he would stop in front of a canal that had been filled in or overbuilt, pointing and describing a bridge or a market that had vanished. Gondoliers, feeling a mix of curiosity and dread, would exchange glances, unsure whether to approach him or avoid him altogether. Whispers of the miraculous, or perhaps the cursed, spread quickly. The city's older residents, those who remembered Venice before modern changes began to reshape the canals, were both alarmed and fascinated. Pietro's words matched their own memories of places that had been altered or lost to time. He described the texture of the stones, the smells of bakeries, the laughter of children long gone, and the routines of families whose descendants had moved away or perished. Many began to suspect that the boy's knowledge was no ordinary imagination. The city, steeped in legend and superstition, interpreted his uncanny accuracy in ways that blurred the lines between the mystical and the historical. Even the merchants, who were accustomed to exaggeration and rumor, found themselves caught in the spell of Pietro's narratives. He would describe the placement of stalls in a long-forgotten market, the types of goods sold, the calls of the vendors, and the reactions of customers. Details that could not have been learned from hearsay or observation of current life were spoken with confidence and precision. Some considered him a prophet, others a vessel for spirits of the past, while still others felt an instinctive fear, as if the boy's knowledge was too vast, too deep, and too impossible for any human to possess. The whispers gained a subtle rhythm of their own, spreading like currents through the city. Gondoliers would warn each other of his presence. "He walks the canals as though he has known them all before." Parents began to caution their children, some with curiosity, others with dread. Pietro became both a fascination and a warning, a living anomaly in a city that already existed between reality and legend. His voice, small yet clear, carried over the water, and people found themselves straining to hear, as though the child's words might reveal hidden truths that could change their understanding of Venice itself. As the days progressed, Pietro's interactions with the public became more deliberate. He would respond to questions with uncanny detail, recounting events of decades past with accuracy that defied belief. He spoke of small accidents, fires, and floods, naming the residents involved, the sequence of events, and the outcomes, even when those events were undocumented. Gondoliers and passers-by often found themselves in hushed awe, some frightened by the implications. Pietro's presence transformed ordinary canals into stages for the supernatural, turning familiar streets into reminders of the city's persistent, unseen history. There was an unmistakable tension in the city's reaction. Some sought to exploit his knowledge, pressing him for details that might reveal lost treasures, forgotten structures, or hidden passages beneath the waters. Others wanted to shield themselves from it, fearing that too much awareness of Venice's past could bring misfortune. Pietro, unaware of the social weight he carried, moved through the city with a quiet determination, recounting memories without expectation, driven by forces that seemed beyond understanding. Every alley, bridge, and canal he spoke of became a thread in the city's larger, spectral tapestry, and the people of Venice began to recognize that their city was more than the living streets they walked. It was a memory, a ghost, and a story, all of which Pietro seemed uniquely able to access. The whispers eventually reached the attention of those in positions of authority, from local clergy to scholars, who began to consider the implications of a child with such knowledge. The mixture of fear and fascination intensified, as Venice's residents wondered if the boy was merely gifted or if he carried something darker, a burden of memory too heavy for any single life. Meanwhile, the canals continued their quiet flow, reflecting the city's beauty, decay, and now the strange presence of a child who seemed to walk between worlds. By the end of this period, Pietro had become a figure of legend in his own lifetime. Gondoliers would tell stories of seeing him standing on the banks of canals, gazing into the water as though conversing with unseen voices. Merchants and residents spoke of his knowledge with a mix of reverence and unease. The city itself seemed to recognize his role as a bridge between its current reality and the forgotten past beneath its waves. Every whisper, every hesitant glance, and every shiver of awe strengthened the sense that Pietro's existence was not merely remarkable, it was a challenge to the understanding of time, memory, and the very nature of Venice. As whispers of Pietro's uncanny knowledge spread through Venice, they eventually reached the ears of the city's clergy, whose influence over public opinion was as potent as the tides themselves. The priests and church officials had long maintained a delicate balance in the city, guiding its citizens with faith while tempering the undercurrents of superstition that ran deep through its canals and alleys. When they learned of a child claiming to recall lives long submerged beneath the water, the response was immediate, cautious, and tinged with unease. It was not simply that the boy spoke of drowned streets and lost families, it was that his words carried an authority and certainty that seemed beyond the comprehension of someone so young. Pietro was brought to the attention of Father Lorenzo, an austere man with a reputation for both wisdom and firmness. The priest first observed Pietro quietly, noting the boy's small stature, the sharpness of his gaze, and the almost unnatural calm with which he described tragedies long past. Pietro spoke freely of events, giving names, dates, and details of lives that no one present could have known. Father Lorenzo listened, recording Pietro's words with a mixture of fascination and dread. The church feared that such claims, if left unchecked, could unsettle the populace or encourage blasphemous speculation. Venice was a city accustomed to miracles and mysteries, yet even here, the idea of a child bridging the living world with the drowned past was extraordinary, alarming, and potentially dangerous. Lucia, Pietro's mother, stood nearby during these examinations, torn between relief and fear. On one hand, she welcomed the guidance and protection of the clergy, on the other, she worried about how the city might treat her son if his abilities were deemed unnatural, heretical, or even cursed. Father Lorenzo approached the situation with a mixture of diplomacy and caution, asking Pietro questions designed to discern whether he spoke out of imagination, divine inspiration, or some hidden knowledge beyond human understanding. Pietro answered simply, his voice steady, offering details that seemed drawn from memory rather than storytelling. The room was silent, save for the child's soft voice and the occasional murmur of an assistant transcribing every word. As word of the boy's visit to the church spread, curiosity and anxiety spread alongside it. Citizens, some drawn by fascination, others by fear, began to gather in the streets surrounding Pietro's home and the church itself. Whispers turned into speculation. Could the child be a prophet, a vessel of divine messages, or a bearer of ancient spirits trapped in Venice's watery past? Some dismissed his accounts entirely, claiming that imagination and coincidence were at work. Others believed Pietro to be a bridge between life and death, a medium through which the city's submerged history spoke again. The tension between skepticism and belief intensified as Pietro's words continued to circulate. Pietro's interactions with the clergy were carefully structured. He would recount specific events of drowned streets, detailing families lost to floods and tragedies that had left their mark on Venice, even when official records did not exist. The priests would ask questions meant to test the limits of his knowledge, probing for inconsistencies, seeking evidence of fabrication or suggestion. Pietro remained consistent, recalling precise details and responding to questions with a calm authority that unsettled the adults in the room. Every account he gave seemed to straddle the line between reality and legend, deepening both fear and fascination. The clergy began to deliberate in private, debating the implications of Pietro's abilities. Some argued that he should be kept under observation, treated as a curious prodigy whose words might illuminate forgotten history. Others warned that his knowledge bordered on the heretical, that speaking of past lives and submerged tragedies could unsettle the faithful and encourage dangerous speculation. Venice, a city with a history of both reverence and suspicion toward the supernatural, had seen prophets, mystics, and charlatans before, yet Pietro's claims carried a level of verifiable detail that challenged even the most careful theologians. Public scrutiny intensified as well. News of the church's involvement reached the markets, gondolas, and taverns, drawing larger crowds to witness the child. Some came out of simple curiosity, hoping to hear the fantastical accounts for themselves. Others arrived with unease, worried that the boy's abilities might bring misfortune or disrupt the social order. Families debated quietly at home, torn between fascination and fear. Teachers and local scholars joined the conversation, weighing whether Pietro's recollections could be historical fact, folklore, or some strange phenomenon beyond comprehension. Venice, a city of layered memories and lost histories, had never seen a child command attention in this way. The dynamic between public curiosity and ecclesiastical caution created an uneasy tension that seemed to hang over the city. Pietro, for his part, remained unaware of the weight of attention pressing down on him. He continued to speak with clarity, detail, and unwavering certainty, describing events, structures, and lives that had long since disappeared beneath the waters of Venice. Each recitation drew gasps, whispers, or silent awe from the adults who listened. His innocence and the authenticity of his demeanor only amplified the city's fascination, casting a light on the mystery that no skepticism could fully dispel. In the streets, the populace began to form subtle factions. Some defended Pietro and his family, seeing the child as a gift, a living bridge to Venice's forgotten past. Others viewed him with suspicion, believing that the boy might be a threat to the city's spiritual or social stability. Conversations became hushed debates, marketplaces filled with murmurs, and gondolas swayed not just with the currents of the canals but with the weight of collective curiosity and anxiety. Pietro's presence, small and fragile yet commanding, had altered the rhythm of the city, bringing the past and present into uneasy contact. By the end of this period, Venice had become a city on edge, suspended between belief and doubt. The clergy's involvement had legitimized Pietro's story to some and heightened suspicion for others. Citizens and officials alike recognized that this was no ordinary child. Pietro's ability to recall events and lives long lost beneath the city's waters had turned him into a living symbol of Venice itself, a city of beauty, decay, and memory, teetering on the threshold of understanding something beyond reason. The tension between innocence and authority, faith and skepticism, had never been more pronounced, and the stage was set for events that would escalate the mystery and challenge the very limits of what the people of Venice believed possible. As days turned into weeks, Pietro's accounts grew more vivid, more precise, and far more troubling to those who listened. His recollections were no longer confined to vanished streets or long-forgotten buildings. He began to speak of tragedies so detailed that they could chill the blood of even the most hardened Venetians. Families lost to floods, merchants swept away during sudden storms, and children who had disappeared without a trace. Pietro described them all with a clarity that seemed impossible for one so young. His mother, Lucia, often caught herself shivering at the boy's words, a mix of fear and awe gripping her whenever he recounted incidents that predated her own life. There was no exaggeration in his voice, no embellishment, only the calm certainty of a child who had lived it, or so he claimed. The public, already aware of Pietro's presence, grew increasingly divided. Gondoliers, once skeptical, now whispered of the uncanny details the boy revealed, noting how his knowledge matched fragments of old records or oral histories thought long lost. Merchants and residents listened closely, some eager to confirm the veracity of his claims, others unsettled by the possibility that a child could carry memories that should have been inaccessible. The city seemed to pulse with a new energy, a quiet tension that hummed through alleyways, taverns, and markets. Pietro had become more than a curiosity, he was a living testament to the city's hidden past, an inexplicable bridge between centuries. In private, Lucia struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what her son revealed. She would sit by the canal, watching him trace invisible lines over submerged streets, listening as he recounted minor tragedies in almost photographic detail. One afternoon, Pietro spoke of a family whose home had been swallowed during a flood, describing the mother's frantic attempts to save her children, the collapse of beams, and the way the water swallowed their cries. His description was so precise that it unnerved even those familiar with Venice's history of floods. Lucia felt a growing sense of helplessness. She could not explain where Pietro's knowledge came from, and she feared for his safety, knowing that others might see his abilities as unnatural, even dangerous. Local scholars and historians, intrigued by the claims, began to take notice. They attempted to corroborate Pietro's accounts, combing through archival records, parish documents, and personal accounts from elderly Venetians. To their astonishment, many of the child's recollections aligned with forgotten events or details that had never been formally recorded. Specific buildings, merchants, and minor tragedies he described matched oral histories preserved only in fragmented memory. The phenomenon was so compelling that some scholars began to question their understanding of memory and history itself. Was Pietro channeling forgotten knowledge, or was this some extraordinary coincidence? The psychological effect on Pietro became increasingly evident. He began to show signs of strain, as if the weight of his memories pressed upon him in ways no adult could endure. Sleep eluded him, he would wake in the night, trembling and whispering the names of people he claimed to have known in lives past. His small hands would clutch at the blankets, as though trying to hold on to the ephemeral fragments of the past he carried inside him. Lucia and his grandmother watched helplessly, caught between awe at the boy's abilities and fear for his mental and emotional well-being. It was clear that Pietro's gift, or curse, was not without consequence. Public fascination escalated alongside concern. Neighbors and merchants began to treat Pietro's every word as potentially prophetic, noting his observations of events long gone and fearing what he might recall next. Some approached him with curiosity, testing his knowledge and asking questions about places and people they had only vaguely remembered. Pietro responded without hesitation, offering details that were both astonishing and terrifying. Each account added to the sense that the boy was a living archive of Venice's submerged history, a repository of memories that should have been lost to time. Religious authorities, still cautious, watched these developments with increasing interest and concern. Pietro's growing reputation as a child who could access forgotten history posed both theological and social questions. Was he divinely inspired, a prodigy touched by God? Or was his knowledge unnatural, potentially leading to moral confusion or fear among the populace? The priests and scholars debated quietly in the shadows, seeking ways to understand or contain the phenomenon without causing panic. Their interventions, though measured, added another layer of scrutiny and tension to Pietro's already extraordinary life. The city itself seemed to respond to Pietro's growing presence. Canals that had once been ordinary now appeared to shimmer with possibility, shadows cast by the buildings seeming to shift in recognition of his words. Gondoliers paused mid-oar when he spoke of submerged streets, their own memories of floods and storms blending with the child's uncanny descriptions. Strangers passing through Venice would hear whispers of the boy who remembered lifetimes beneath the water, and their imaginations would inevitably fill in the gaps, weaving Pietro's reality into legend. Yet despite the escalating public attention, Pietro remained a child. He played along the canals, laughed with other children, and indulged in small mischief. This juxtaposition, innocence and burdened knowledge existing in the same fragile body, made him all the more compelling and all the more unsettling. He embodied the tension between life and history, between joy and grief, between the visible world and the memories of the drowned. Venice had never before witnessed a presence quite like his, a child who could carry the city's forgotten past in his words and his gaze. By the end of this period, Pietro's life had become a delicate balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. He was at once a boy with friends, a child who laughed and played, and a vessel of Venice's hidden past, burdened with details and tragedies no one else could verify. His confessions had deepened the mystery to a degree that defied explanation, leaving both family and city grappling with awe, fear, and an ever-growing fascination. Venice itself seemed poised to bend under the weight of the story he carried, as the child who remembered lifetimes beneath the sea became a living testament to the persistence of memory, the fragility of innocence, and the inescapable pull of history. The boy who remembered lifetimes beneath the canals of Venice soon drew the attention of more than just local residents and clergy. Word reached doctors, early psychologists, and scholars intrigued by claims that a child could possess knowledge of events long lost to history. At first, many approached the situation with a clinical skepticism, certain that Pietro's recollections were either the result of suggestion, keen observation, or simple imagination. Yet as they observed him, they quickly realized that his knowledge defied conventional explanations. The details he provided, the layout of submerged streets, the names of families lost to floods, and the sequence of long-forgotten events, were far too precise to be attributed to ordinary learning or hearsay. One physician, Dr. Alessandro Ferri, visited Pietro in his modest home, notebook in hand, intent on applying early methods of psychological assessment. He questioned the boy carefully, asking him to recount events from memory and to describe places and people from decades before his birth. Pietro responded calmly and consistently, offering a stream of information that Dr. Ferri found at once fascinating and deeply unsettling. He described the placement of windows and doors in buildings no longer standing, the types of goods sold in vanished markets, and even the specific gestures and behaviors of individuals who had lived long ago. Each detail, Dr. Ferri noted in his journal, suggested a depth of knowledge impossible for a child of 7. Skeptical inquiry soon expanded beyond medicine into other academic fields. Historians and geographers attempted to corroborate Pietro's recollections, poring over archival records, maps, and oral accounts preserved by elderly Venetians. Time and again, Pietro's descriptions matched forgotten realities. He would describe a sunken bridge with precise dimensions, recalling which families lived nearby and how their lives had intersected with the city's tides and floods. Scholars began to realize that Pietro's knowledge was neither random nor fabricated. It was, in some sense, historically verifiable, yet obtained through a means that defied reason and scientific understanding. Pietro's mother watched these inquiries with growing apprehension. While she welcomed the attention of educated observers, she feared that their scrutiny could overburden her son, that dissecting his memories for scientific understanding might strip them of their human and emotional context. The boy himself remained indifferent to these concerns. To him, recounting the past was as natural as breathing. He did not understand why adults were so fascinated by knowledge he carried effortlessly, and he did not grasp the fear his accounts inspired. For Pietro, the memories of lives lost beneath the water were a constant presence, neither terrifying nor joyous, simply undeniable. As the inquiries continued, it became apparent that Pietro's ability challenged the assumptions of the time. Psychologists suggested that he might be experiencing an unusual form of eidetic memory, a rare capacity to retain and reproduce intricate details with perfect accuracy. Others posited that he might be extraordinarily perceptive, capable of intuiting details from subtle clues in his environment. Yet even the most generous explanations failed to account for the historical specificity of his claims, for the way he could recall events and structures for which there was no contemporary record. The tension between empirical reasoning and the undeniable evidence of Pietro's knowledge created a climate of both curiosity and unease. In some cases, Pietro's accounts prompted direct investigation. Scholars would accompany him along the canals, testing his recollections against buildings, alleyways, and traces of foundations submerged or long destroyed. Pietro would identify streets no longer present, describe the orientation of former shops, and recount the movements of people who had vanished decades earlier. The investigators, initially skeptical, were frequently forced to acknowledge that the child's memories contained elements that were, if not impossible, then extraordinarily improbable. Each verification added layers of both credibility and mystery, deepening the fascination surrounding him. Yet for all the scientific interest, Pietro remained, in essence, a child. He played, he laughed, he quarreled with his mother, and he wandered the alleys of Venice with the curiosity and innocence of someone who had no conscious understanding of the magnitude of his own abilities. This juxtaposition, ordinary childhood alongside extraordinary memory, heightened the tension in every observer. Scholars and doctors found themselves unsettled not just by what Pietro knew, but by the calm and natural way in which he carried that knowledge. His awareness of historical events seemed innate, effortless, and yet completely inaccessible to reason or methodology. The inquiries also revealed the psychological burden Pietro carried. He often seemed distant, his mind wandering to the lives he remembered beneath the waters. At times, he would pause mid-sentence, eyes glazed, as if seeing a scene no one else could witness. He sometimes experienced tremors of fear or grief when recounting tragedies, and his voice would falter as he spoke of children lost or families destroyed by floods. Scientists and observers began to realize that the boy was not simply a vessel of knowledge, but also a bearer of human suffering, carrying the emotional weight of lives that had long since ended. This recognition tempered their fascination with empathy, making the investigation as much about care as inquiry. Despite attempts at rationalization, Pietro's abilities resisted categorization. Every theory, from advanced memory to hidden perception, fell short of fully explaining the depth and specificity of his recollections. Observers began to confront the possibility that the child was tapping into something beyond ordinary understanding, a phenomenon that could not be measured or confined by contemporary science. His presence challenged assumptions about memory, consciousness, and the boundaries between life and history. By the end of this period, Venice had become a city that viewed Pietro through dual lenses, as a child, innocent and vulnerable, and as a living archive, whose memories of the drowned past demanded attention, reverence, and respect. Scholars continued to observe, question, and speculate, but each visit only deepened the mystery. Pietro's ability to recall lives and events lost beneath the canals remained both astonishing and unsettling, a puzzle that science could not yet solve, and perhaps, a challenge to the very limits of human understanding. The boy who remembered lifetimes beneath the sea had become a symbol of both the wonders and the enigmas of Venice itself, straddling the boundary between knowledge and legend. As Pietro's fame, or infamy, spread through Venice, the boy began to experience a subtle but profound isolation. The very knowledge that made him extraordinary also set him apart, erecting invisible walls between himself and the other children who once played alongside him in the narrow alleys and along the canal banks. Friends who had once chased him with laughter now hung back, uncertain how to approach someone whose words revealed events and lives beyond their comprehension. Adults, too, treated him with a mix of awe, caution, and fear, constantly monitoring what he said and whom he interacted with. Slowly, Pietro became a child surrounded by people yet entirely alone, burdened by the weight of memories he did not fully understand and could not share in ordinary conversation. The isolation was not only social but also emotional. Every day, Pietro carried the memories of lives drowned, streets submerged, and tragedies unrecorded, a ceaseless current flowing through his mind. At times, he would retreat to the quiet corners of Venice, tracing the outlines of vanished buildings with his small fingers, murmuring names and details of lives that had long ended. The intensity of his recollections created a distance between his internal world and the living city around him. Even when he laughed or played, there was a shadow in his eyes, a weight that no ordinary child should bear. His mother, Lucia, watched him with increasing concern, recognizing the toll that these invisible burdens were taking on his small body and fragile spirit. The canals themselves seemed to reflect Pietro's solitude. He would wander along stretches of water where the reflections of ancient palaces danced with the morning mist, speaking softly to figures only he could see. Fishermen and gondoliers who observed him from a distance noted the unusual intensity in his gaze, the way he seemed to commune with an unseen past. For Pietro, these memories were as vivid as the present, full of sensory detail, the sound of splintering wood during a flood, the cries of children lost beneath the tide, the shimmer of light on submerged stone. Every recollection was an imprint on his consciousness, and every imprint deepened the sense of isolation that clung to him like the damp Venetian fog. Attempts by adults to engage him or temper his experiences were only partially successful. Priests and scholars tried to provide structure, offering questions, observation, and guidance in the hope of channeling his abilities safely. They encouraged him to recount what he remembered in measured ways, to speak only under supervision, and to rest when the strain became evident. Yet Pietro's mind did not adhere to these rules. Memories arose unbidden, flooding him with knowledge of lives he had never physically experienced, and at times he would speak spontaneously in public spaces, alarming those nearby and reinforcing his sense of being apart from ordinary human experience. The psychological weight of remembering lives and events far older than his own existence began to manifest physically. Pietro often appeared fatigued, his small frame slumping with exhaustion, dark circles forming beneath his eyes. Sleep was elusive, disrupted by dreams that were indistinguishable from memory. In these moments, he would cry softly, murmuring names and places, the voices of the long-dead pressing upon him. Lucia found herself holding him through these episodes, unsure whether to comfort or protect him, and realizing that no embrace could lift the burden he carried. His grandmother whispered prayers, invoking saints and angels, hoping to shield him from forces she could neither see nor understand. Public fascination intensified Pietro's sense of separation. Crowds that once marveled now stared, sometimes with hope, sometimes with suspicion. Children avoided him, adults questioned, observed, and speculated. Every interaction reinforced the perception that Pietro was different, not simply in knowledge but in essence. Venice, for all its history of embracing eccentricity and legend, seemed unsure how to contain a child who straddled the boundary between the living and the remembered dead. His life became a series of carefully managed encounters, each one a reminder of how extraordinary, and how lonely, his existence had become. The boy's isolation was compounded by the unpredictability of his memories. Certain moments would trigger a cascade of recollections, sending Pietro into intense reverie. He would suddenly stop walking, gaze into the distance, and speak in detail of entire families, festivals, or tragedies, events that had no apparent connection to his immediate surroundings. Adults would gather, holding their breath, unsure whether they were witnessing brilliance, madness, or something neither entirely human nor comprehensible. Pietro himself seemed unaware of the social rules he was breaking. In his mind, recounting the past was as natural as breathing, yet in the world around him, it deepened the chasm between his experience and that of everyone else. Even ordinary interactions became complex. Playmates could not relate to the weight he carried, teachers, friends, and merchants struggled to reconcile the child they saw with the boy whose words carried centuries of history. Every conversation, every glance, seemed to filter through the lens of his extraordinary awareness, leaving him isolated even when surrounded by the living. The canals, the bridges, the stone facades of Venice, everywhere he went, the city mirrored his separation, reflecting a world caught between the present and the submerged past. By the end of this period, Pietro's isolation had become a defining feature of his existence. It was not simply the absence of companionship but the presence of unshareable knowledge, a burden both emotional and cognitive. He remained a child in body, yet in mind and memory, he carried the weight of generations long vanished beneath the waters. The streets, alleys, and canals of Venice bore witness to a boy alone amidst a city teeming with life, his solitude amplified by the enormity of what he knew and the impossibility of sharing it fully. In this way, the stage was set for events that would test not only his endurance but the city's understanding of memory, history, and the fine line between genius and burden, between the living and the remembered. As the weeks and months passed, the rhythm of Pietro's life, the small routines of childhood, the quiet domestic patterns of his home, began to crumble under the weight of his knowledge and the public fascination it had generated. Venice, a city long accustomed to eccentricity and legend, could not fully absorb the implications of a child who remembered lifetimes submerged beneath its canals. Where once Pietro moved among neighbors and peers with relative ease, his presence now drew attention that was both intrusive and relentless. Crowds gathered along the narrow streets and bridges, gondoliers paused mid-oar to observe him, and merchants whispered warnings to one another, unsure whether the boy's abilities were miraculous or malevolent. The balance between ordinary life and extraordinary knowledge had begun to fracture. Within the family home, the collapse was more intimate and immediate. Lucia, already strained by the responsibility of raising Pietro and maintaining a household in a city that seemed to test its residents at every turn, found her world narrowing to the boy's needs and the management of his peculiar abilities. Pietro, burdened by memories of events and lives he could neither change nor fully comprehend, grew increasingly restless and irritable. The small pleasures of childhood, play, laughter, simple curiosity, became fleeting moments, overshadowed by the constant pull of the past that demanded his attention. Each day brought new recollections, and each recollection deepened the sense that normalcy was slipping away, leaving behind a life defined more by history than by the present. The boy's behavior began to reflect this tension. He would sometimes become withdrawn for hours, staring silently at the water as if expecting to see figures emerge from the depths. At other times, he would speak rapidly, recounting tragedies with such intensity that those around him felt both awe and fear. His emotional responses were unpredictable. Moments of laughter could shift abruptly into despair as he relived the suffering of people long gone. The family, while deeply devoted, struggled to maintain stability. Even his grandmother, a woman hardened by decades of hardship, found herself unnerved by the intensity of Pietro's experiences. She whispered prayers more frequently, seeking divine protection for a child whose life seemed increasingly entwined with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Outside the home, Venice itself began to reflect the disruption in Pietro's life. Gossip spread quickly, and fear mingled with fascination. Some residents believed that the child's knowledge could foretell calamities or reveal hidden truths about the city's submerged past. Others considered him a vessel of misfortune, a living reminder that the boundaries between the living and the dead were not as distinct as they had once believed. Markets, canals, and alleyways became charged with tension, as citizens anticipated his movements and reacted to his accounts with both reverence and trepidation. The ordinary ebb and flow of city life faltered under the weight of extraordinary expectation. Even the clergy and scholars who had previously approached Pietro with cautious curiosity found their sense of control slipping. Priests who had hoped to manage the boy's exposure to the public were forced to contend with growing crowds and the unpredictability of his memories. Scholars attempting to study his abilities encountered obstacles. Pietro's recollections arrived unbidden, outside of any schedule or method, often in the middle of bustling streets or crowded marketplaces. Each new episode of recollection drew attention, creating a feedback loop in which his fame intensified, and the city's attempt to maintain equilibrium collapsed further. Pietro's isolation deepened alongside this societal disruption. Where before he had sometimes found solace in quiet corners or the companionship of a few sympathetic adults, now he was constantly observed, evaluated, and whispered about. Children avoided him, unsure how to relate to someone whose mind was filled with centuries of memory. Adults treated him with caution, often speaking in hushed tones or pressing questions that carried weight beyond his years. Even the most mundane interactions, crossing a bridge, passing a market stall, or greeting a neighbor, were now fraught with tension, reminders that normal life was slipping further from reach. The boy's own understanding of his situation remained limited. For Pietro, recounting past lives was neither extraordinary nor burdensome in intent, it was simply what he knew. Yet the intensity of public scrutiny and the emotional weight of the memories themselves created stress that manifested in sleeplessness, irritability, and sudden bouts of quiet melancholy. Moments of childhood joy were punctuated by long periods of focus on past events, as if the present world could offer no distraction from the lives that clung to his consciousness. The collapse of normalcy was therefore both internal and external, a confluence of social pressure and personal burden that reshaped the contours of his life. The city, ever attuned to the currents of superstition and history, seemed to respond to this disruption. Venice, a place where every canal and alley carried the weight of centuries, reflected Pietro's own fractured reality. Shadows lengthened in unexpected ways, water in the canals appeared darker or more turbulent than usual, and the ordinary sounds of the city, the creak of oars, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants, took on a new, uneasy resonance. Residents began to interpret these subtle changes as signs, either of divine influence or of a warning, amplifying the sense that normalcy had been irrevocably altered by the presence of the child. By the end of this period, it became clear that life in Venice could no longer operate under the assumptions of ordinary existence. Pietro's abilities had not merely attracted attention, they had reshaped the rhythms of the city, disrupted daily routines, and blurred the line between the everyday and the extraordinary. Families whispered in fear, scholars debated in quiet rooms, and the clergy pondered the spiritual implications of a child who remembered lifetimes beneath the waters. Pietro himself remained a child, unaware of the full scope of the disruption he caused, yet carrying the weight of memory and expectation that would define the next phase of his life and the growing legend that surrounded him. The passage of time did little to diminish the fascination surrounding Pietro, the child who remembered lifetimes beneath the waters of Venice. Though the intensity of public attention had begun to wane, the impact of his knowledge remained, leaving both the city and those closest to him in a state of uneasy reflection. Pietro himself had grown quieter, retreating more often to the solitude of the canals and alleys, speaking only when compelled by the persistent flow of memory. The memories he carried were no less vivid, no less burdensome, they had simply become a constant presence, interwoven with his perception of the present, shaping his experience of life in ways that were difficult for anyone else to comprehend. Lucia, his mother, felt the ongoing weight of these events most keenly. She had lived through the initial shock, the scrutiny of clergy and scholars, the curiosity and fear of neighbors, and the public spectacle that had transformed her son into an object of fascination. Now, she was left with the quieter challenge of supporting Pietro as he navigated a world that continued to misunderstand him. Even in private moments, the boy's mind often seemed elsewhere, dwelling on lives that no longer existed. She worried that his extraordinary memories, though never fully articulated in the presence of outsiders, had left him emotionally isolated, burdened by empathy for people long gone, and by the impossible task of reconciling their existence with his own. Venice itself had changed in subtle but lasting ways. The canals, streets, and palaces that had once seemed merely historical now seemed alive with the echoes of Pietro's recollections. Citizens began to speak in hushed tones about the vanished bridges, sunken markets, and forgotten families that he had described. Some called it miraculous, others ominous, yet all recognized that the boy's memories had altered the way they perceived their city. The sense of wonder, unease, and lingering grief persisted, threading through conversations, affecting gondoliers, merchants, and scholars alike. Pietro had brought the past into the present in a way that refused to be ignored, leaving a mark on the consciousness of Venice itself. Scholars who had once studied Pietro with rigor and skepticism now reflected on their observations with a mixture of awe and frustration. Many records and oral histories had been confirmed, yet countless details remained unverifiable, leaving them to speculate about the origin of his extraordinary knowledge. Some proposed theories of hereditary memory, suggesting that Pietro had somehow absorbed the experiences of ancestors or other individuals. Others leaned toward mystical explanations, considering the possibility that he was a vessel for the collective memory of Venice, a child through whom the city itself spoke. No conclusion satisfied all questions, and the unresolved nature of his abilities only heightened the intrigue surrounding his life. The clergy, too, wrestled with the aftermath. Priests who had monitored Pietro's development and guided the family in measured ways continued to ponder the spiritual implications. Was the child's gift a sign of divine intervention, a test of faith, or a cautionary tale about the persistence of memory and suffering? Some found comfort in viewing Pietro as a living miracle, while others feared that his abilities challenged the natural order, blurring the line between life and death. Regardless of interpretation, the priests recognized that his presence had left an indelible impression on the community, one that would endure long after the immediate spectacle had passed. Pietro's personal development was marked by a delicate balance between ordinary childhood and the extraordinary weight of remembrance. He continued to play in quiet corners, to laugh, and to experience fleeting moments of joy, but these moments were always tinged with the awareness of lives and events beyond his own. Friends and peers often struggled to relate to him fully, sensing the gulf created by the depth of his knowledge and the intensity of his perception. Pietro, for his part, seemed unaware of the magnitude of what he carried, yet the burden of memory shaped his interactions, making him both empathetic and distant, observant and quietly detached. As years passed, Pietro's accounts of submerged Venice became part of the city's living memory. Scholars referenced him in manuscripts and journals, neighbors recalled him in whispered stories, and gondoliers retold fragments of his descriptions to visitors and apprentices. He became a symbol of the persistent past, a reminder that history was never fully gone, that memory could linger beneath the waters, shaping perception, emotion, and community. The boy who had once walked the canals as a living conduit for the forgotten now existed as a legend in the collective consciousness of Venice, his story echoing in alleys and across bridges long after the immediate details had faded from everyday life. Yet questions remained, lingering like mist over the canals. How had Pietro acquired such knowledge? Was it inherited, mystical, divine, or simply an extraordinary anomaly of the human mind? Could anyone ever fully comprehend the experiences he carried, or were they destined to remain beyond understanding, a silent testament to the persistence of memory and the limits of reason? These questions were debated quietly by scholars and clergy, pondered privately by citizens, and speculated upon in hushed tones by those who had once witnessed Pietro's abilities firsthand. Each unanswered question reinforced the sense that the mystery was ongoing, a thread connecting the present to the vanished lives he had remembered. The emotional impact of Pietro's story also endured. Those who had known him intimately, the family, the clergy, and a handful of devoted scholars, remained aware of the personal cost of his gift. The boy had carried within him centuries of human experience, including grief, fear, and loss, and this burden shaped his personality, his interactions, and his understanding of life itself. Even as he matured, the tension between ordinary existence and extraordinary memory persisted, creating a subtle but constant strain that colored every choice he made and every relationship he formed. By the end of this period, Venice had learned to live with Pietro's legacy. The city no longer reacted with the immediate shock and fascination of his earlier years, yet the echoes of his memories continued to shape cultural memory, social consciousness, and collective storytelling. The boy who remembered lifetimes beneath the sea had become an enduring symbol, a reminder that the past was never truly gone and that some mysteries, no matter how extraordinary, resist explanation and remain alive in the spaces between memory and legend. Pietro's story was one of wonder, sorrow, and enduring intrigue, a testament to the fragility of childhood, the persistence of history, and the ways in which the human mind can bear witness to lives that exist beyond ordinary perception. As Pietro grew older, the city of Venice continued to grapple with the legacy of the boy who remembered lifetimes beneath its canals. Scholars, clergy, and ordinary citizens alike debated endlessly about the origins and nature of his extraordinary knowledge, each theory offering a partial answer while leaving lingering uncertainties. Some believed that Pietro's abilities were the result of an inherited gift, a rare phenomenon passed down through generations, a thread of memory carried in blood that connected him to the lives of those long vanished. This explanation, though appealing to some, could not account for the precision and depth of his recollections, the way he described events in meticulous detail, or the emotional resonance of tragedies he had never physically witnessed. Others turned to mystical or spiritual interpretations, suggesting that Pietro was a conduit through which the spirits of the past communicated with the living. Venice, with its labyrinthine canals and centuries of layered history, was fertile ground for such beliefs. The idea that a child could serve as a vessel for the memories of the drowned or the long-forgotten resonated deeply with a population accustomed to legends, omens, and the unseen forces of the city. Priests who had observed Pietro cautiously entertained the possibility that divine will or supernatural intervention played a role in his unusual abilities, though they remained hesitant to declare anything definitive for fear of public scandal or spiritual misguidance. Psychologists and early theorists of human cognition approached Pietro's case with careful, methodical scrutiny. Some posited that his memory might be an extreme manifestation of eidetic recall, a mental faculty so advanced that it allowed him to reconstruct entire lifetimes from fragments of sensory input, stories overheard, or subtle environmental cues. Others speculated about latent ancestral memory or collective unconscious, ideas that suggested human experience could, under rare circumstances, transcend individual lifespans. Yet despite the rigor of these inquiries, no empirical explanation fully satisfied the breadth of Pietro's recollections. The boy's knowledge remained a puzzle, one that challenged assumptions about memory, perception, and the boundaries of human experience. The citizens of Venice, meanwhile, incorporated Pietro's story into the fabric of the city's mythology. Gondoliers would recount his accounts to apprentices, merchants would speak of him quietly to patrons, and parents would tell their children tales of the boy who remembered the city before it was. In these retellings, Pietro became both legend and cautionary figure, a reminder of the persistence of history, the fragility of innocence, and the thin line separating ordinary life from extraordinary experience. Venice itself seemed to acknowledge his legacy, as though the canals, palaces, and sunken streets remembered the boy's words and reflected them back in the quiet murmur of the waters. Despite the passage of time, unanswered questions continued to linger. How had Pietro acquired such vivid knowledge of events long before his birth? Was it a natural anomaly, a gift, or a supernatural occurrence? Could any human fully comprehend the weight of the lives he remembered, or were these memories destined to remain partially unknowable, glimpsed only through the child's unique perception? Each new inquiry seemed only to deepen the mystery, highlighting the limitations of reason when confronted with phenomena that defy conventional understanding. Pietro's personal journey remained entwined with these questions. The burden of memory never left him, the lives he recalled, the tragedies he witnessed, and the streets he traced with his words continued to influence his perception of the present. Even as he matured, he carried an awareness of impermanence and loss that few children, or adults, could comprehend. His experiences fostered a profound empathy, a sensitivity to suffering that extended beyond his own era and reached into the lives of those who had come before him. Yet this empathy also created an enduring solitude, a quiet separation from those who could not fully understand the magnitude of what he carried. Attempts to document his abilities became a careful blend of observation, transcription, and preservation. Scholars recorded his recollections, attempting to match them with historical records, oral traditions, and physical remnants of the city. Priests offered spiritual guidance, seeking to protect both the boy and the community from misinterpretation or panic. Citizens shared stories, preserving the echoes of Pietro's memory in ways that were informal yet enduring. In every effort, the tension between understanding and mystery remained, a reminder that some phenomena resist total explanation, existing instead in the liminal space between fact, memory, and legend. As Pietro aged, the city gradually returned to its rhythm, though traces of his influence persisted. Scholars continued to reference his accounts in historical research, priests occasionally cited his story as an illustration of divine mystery, and residents shared anecdotes that blurred the line between lived experience and folklore. Venice had learned to live with the boy's extraordinary presence, integrating it into its cultural consciousness while acknowledging that the full truth of his abilities might never be known. The canals, ever-patient witnesses to centuries of human endeavor and misfortune, reflected the enduring tension between memory and time, between knowledge and the unknowable. The unresolved nature of Pietro's story ensured that it remained a subject of fascination for generations. Travelers, historians, and storytellers revisited his accounts, pondering the implications of a child who could remember lives long submerged beneath the sea. Each retelling added layers of interpretation, speculation, and emotional resonance, expanding the mystery while preserving its core truths. Pietro's legacy was thus both concrete and intangible. He had altered the understanding of memory, history, and human perception while leaving behind a sense of wonder, awe, and profound humility in the face of the unknown. By the end of this period, the boy who remembered lifetimes beneath the canals had become a figure straddling two worlds, the documented and the legendary, the observed and the felt. His story challenged assumptions about the limits of human cognition, the persistence of history, and the ways in which the past continues to shape the present. Venice itself, a city built on memory, legend, and water, had embraced him as a symbol of both its own mysteries and the enduring power of human perception. Pietro's life, both extraordinary and unresolved, remained a testament to the mysteries that linger beneath the surface of the world, waiting for those rare individuals who can bear witness to what has been lost and yet never truly vanished. Even today, his tale continues to inspire reflection on the boundaries between memory, history, and imagination. Scholars, storytellers, and citizens alike acknowledge that some phenomena may never be fully explained, that the weight of knowledge can coexist with innocence, and that the human mind, in its rarest forms, may carry within it the echoes of lives long past. Pietro's legacy, therefore, is not merely the details he remembered but the enduring questions he left behind, the emotional truths he conveyed, and the reminder that the line between the living and the remembered is far thinner than most will ever perceive. His story closes not with answers but with the haunting persistence of wonder, leaving Venice, and the world, forever changed by the child who remembered lifetimes beneath the sea.